Thank you, Joan, for the invitation to speak at the workshop. In this presentation, I've tried to connect the main areas of my research to the themes of both the network and to the panel today. So my research has examined a couple of ways in which the politicization of trade has been manifested in the case of Canada. As I said, my own research has examined a couple of ways in which the politicization of trade has been manifested in the case of Canada. The first of these is the contestation of international trade. First of all, certain provisions within trade agreements restrict the ability of governments to strengthen environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And so the best example of this form of contestation was the reaction to a number of investor-state dispute settlement cases that grew out of NAFTA's Chapter 11 on investment, which gave investors in one NAFTA country the ability to bring forward claims against the government of another NAFTA country for taking actions that adversely affected the profits they expected to gain from their investment. And so a number of Chapter 11 cases brought against Canada involved actions that the government justified on environmental grounds. So those of you that have been watching what's been going on in Canada with respect to Chapter 11 cases, this is just a selection of cases that involved environmental actions taken by the Canadian government that resulted in some measures being reversed by the Canadian government, and or millions of dollars paid out to corporations in damages and costs for these actions. So protest over these ISDS provisions was particularly strong in Canada, which was a country that had the most Chapter 11 claims against it. And there were a number of consequences to this form of politicization. First of all, early on was the defeat of an effort to negotiate a multilateral agreement on investment in the OECD in 1998, which is spearheaded by some activist groups like the Council of Canadians in Canada, Public Citizen in the United States. It also eventually contributed to the weakening of the ISDS provisions in the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, which eliminated the ISDS process for investment between Canada and the United States. ISDS provisions also contributed to the politicization of the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement in both Canada and the EU. And again, the Council of Canadians was very active in collaboration with scores of European and other Canadian groups in opposing the CETA. A second ground upon which trade agreements have been contested in Canada is the concern that the intensified competition unleashed by integrating markets would make governments less willing to adequately enforce and strengthen environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And the argument here was that the intense competition, international competition, would put pressure on governments to weaken enforcement of environmental laws and contribute to regulatory chill, in which governments would be reluctant to strengthen environmental policies for fear of making producers less cost competitive and making the country less attractive to investors. Now, this concern was vindicated in a sense by a second form of politicization, which involved the promotion of a discourse asserting that more ambitious environmental policies will undermine Canada's international competitiveness, something that I call the trade-off, elsewhere I call the trade-off frame of the relationship between competitiveness and environmental policies. And so some of the arguments offered in this discourse are that producers will lose domestic and foreign market share, investors will be deterred from making new investments, industrial flight will occur, and serious and widespread damage to the national economy will result. That it will wreck the Canadian economy, in the words of people like Stephen Harper. But rather than being used to oppose trade liberalization, this discourse has been employed by certain political actors, including those in government, to oppose the strengthening of environmental policies, particularly in the area of climate change. So that involves the claims that the adoption of more ambitious climate policies, like carbon pricing, would harm international competitiveness and contribute to carbon leakage. This frame was adopted by a coalition of policy actors in Canada who shaped Canada's climate policies for many years. And my investigation of the use of this discourse in debates on carbon pricing shows that there are a number of leading advocates of this particular framing of the relationship between trade liberalization and environmental protection. Not surprisingly, the business community was solidly opposed to carbon pricing prior to 2006, including the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, the governments of some oil-producing provinces and Saskatchewan, conservative, national conservative parties, think tanks, media outlets, and also some ministers in the Chrétien and Martin governments, ministers of finance and natural resources in particular. One of the ways in which this, before I get to that, one of the things I would argue about this form of politicization is that it has been detrimental not just for environmental policies and environmental protection efforts, but for trade interests as well, by contributing to a growing sense that governments are increasingly powerless, that democratic governance is being eroded. This fuels anti-globalization sentiment and has been fueling anti-globalization sentiment in countries around the world. So one of the ways in which this form of politicization has been challenged is through the promotion of a counter discourse that offers a different frame of the relationship between environmental protection and international competitiveness, what I've called a synergy frame in my study of the politics of climate change in Canada, that holds not only that more ambitious climate policies are compatible with competitiveness, but they are necessary to preserve it. And so here are some of the arguments that are offered by that particular framing, that the costs of compliance are not significant for all industries. So the overall impact resulting from any loss of competitiveness will be limited on a national scale. Producers will find a way to adapt to the new cost structure imposed by carbon pricing. Investors prefer environmental regimes that are clear and predictable, and are increasingly motivated by environmental, social, and governance considerations. Exporters may avoid trade barriers imposed by other countries with more stringent environmental policies. Efficiency gains and technological innovation will be encouraged that will enhance competitiveness, and that environmental policies will stimulate the growth of new clean industries and give them first mover advantage in international competition. So at first, the number of political actors that adhered to this frame was fairly limited in Canada, and was confined largely to a group of environmental NGOs, but also to the environment ministers of the Chrétien and Martin governments, David Anderson and Stéphane Dion. However, over time, the numbers grew and featured the defection of some influential actors, notably the governments of some oil and gas producing provinces, particularly in Alberta after the election of 2015, and even a number of oil and gas companies, including major oil sands producers, such as Shell, Suncor, Canadian Natural Resources, and Cenovus. This frame has become so dominant, I would argue, that even some of the last holdouts of the trade-off frame are finally putting aside their opposition to carbon pricing, most notably the leader of the federal Conservative Party, Erin O'Toole. So in terms of ideas for reconciling trade and environment, in addition to promoting an alternative discourse, what else can be done to mitigate both forms of politicization? How might opposition to trade and trade agreements based on their environmental impacts be reduced? I'm sure other panelists on today's panel and in upcoming panels will have more to say about this. Just wanted to finish off by just briefly mentioning a few ideas for this kind of reconciliation. Certainly the inclusion of environmental provisions in trade agreements may help, but only if they're meaningful. And so one form this could take is for trade institutions to adopt greater flexibility and allowing exceptions to trade liberalization rules for environmental protection measures, such as border carbon adjustments, to offset the potential competitiveness effects of more ambitious environmental policies. It could also include the removal of some of the more offending aspects of past trade and investment agreements, such as the ISDS provisions related to environmental protection. Also by including stricter rules limiting and eliminating subsidies for fossil fuel industries, by including measures to liberalize trade in green technologies, goods, and services. And then finally, I would argue that making more progress in strengthening environmental and climate policies and agreements generally may have the effect of weakening concerns about the environmental impacts of trade and trade agreements.
Thank you so much for that very, I think, incisive introduction to our topic, and also for staying within the time that I asked you to. So that will allow us now to move on to our next speaker, who is Jean-Frédéric Morin, who is a professor of political science in the political science department at Laval University and also a Canada Research Chair in international political economy. His research focuses on international institutions and how they interact with one another, with particular interest in trade, environmental protection, as well as intellectual property and space governance. Very appropriate to our interests here, he has recently published a book with MIT Press in 2020, Greening Through Trade, as well as another book with Oxford University Press on global environmental politics. So I'll turn over the floor to him now.
I'd like to thank the organizers for their invitation. This is a very exciting network, and it's an interesting series of workshop, and it's really a pleasure for me to be here. And I guess I'll build on David's presentation by discussing some of the empirical evidence behind what David's called the synergy frame. And you mentioned those environmental provision in trade agreements. And so this will be the focus of this presentation. And I will focus more specifically on the effects of these environmental provisions. I won't have time to discuss the motivations that drive the inclusion of environmental provision in trade agreements, but I'll be happy, of course, to discuss this in the Q&A. So let's start with the trade agreements themselves. So in this figure, you have the number of new trade agreements concluded every year since 1948. In total, you have 730 different trade agreements in this figure. And so as you can see, the number of new trade agreements has been declining in the last, 2 decades, but the depth of trade agreements is certainly increasing. Now, what are the environmental impacts of these deep environmental trade agreements? Well, trade agreements can have various effects on the environment. There are direct effects, scale effects, trade composition effects, technology-related effects, regulatory effects. And I think there are good reasons to believe that trade agreements can be harmful to the environment in some ways, for example, just by increasing production levels. But there are also good reasons to believe that trade agreements can be a force for good, for example, by accelerating the diffusion of green technologies. So to me, the real question is not which side of this debate is empirically accurate. I think both sides raise valid point. I think the real question is whether the positive environmental effect can outweigh the negative environmental effect. So in short, what is the net effect of trade agreements? And I strongly believe that the design of trade agreements matter a great deal to explain this net environmental effect of trade agreements. Some trade agreements are simply better designed than others to have a net positive effect on the environment. I won't have time in this presentation to discuss the design features that are the most harmful for the environment. For this presentation, I will focus exclusively on provisions that have the potential to contribute positively to environmental protection. So here you have the number of environmental provision per year. As you can see in this figure, the number of environmental provision is increasing in trade agreements. So for every year, you have the highest number of environmental provision for a trade agreement concluded that year. That's the red line. You have the average number of environmental provision for all trade agreements for that year. That's in yellow. And you have the trade agreement with the lowest number of environmental provision for that year. So basically, every few years, the record of the trade agreement with the highest number of environmental provision is broken. And if you look in the trade agreements for the last decade or 15 years, all of them will include at least a few environmental provision. And it's important to keep in mind that those environmental provision, especially in the last few years, they're not just exceptions to trade commitment. Recent trade agreements will typically include full-fledged chapter devoted to the environment with various types of environmental provision. I have a data set with nearly 300 different types of environmental provision. And to be sure, some of those environmental provision probably just serve window dressing purposes. They don't do anything. But some other environmental provision, for example, on forestry or on genetic resources, can be even more specific than the provision found in multilateral environmental agreements. Recent studies have found that trade agreements with environmental provisions, in contrast to agreement without such provision, are associated with reduced level of pollution and deforestation. And in some cases, it seems that these reductions in environmental degradation are sufficient to offset the increased degradation generated by other provisions in the trade agreement. However, it is unclear which specific provisions have the most positive environmental impact and how they achieve those results. Because the causal chain linking, on the one hand, the adoption of a trade agreement with environmental provisions to improve environmental performance is very long, and there are multiple intervening and moderating variables that are at play in this long causal chain. So, for example, how a trade agreement that does not even mention climate change can lead to a reduction of CO2 emission. Well, there are various possible causal pathways. Could be ratification of multilateral environmental agreements, could be enforcement mechanism, cooperation mechanism, environmental aid, trade composition. So I'll just briefly discuss some of those mechanisms. First up, reference to multilateral environmental agreements. As you can see in this figure, several trade agreements will refer to multilateral environmental agreements. Many of them will include, many trade agreements will include a requirement to ratify a set of multilateral environmental agreements, including the Paris Agreement for recent trade agreements. And potentially this can increase participation in multilateral environmental governance and perhaps indirectly increase environmental performance. And so we had a look at it. We compare the signature date of trade agreements and the ratification date of multilateral environmental agreements. And we have found that for almost all trade agreements referring to a multilateral environmental agreement, those trade agreements were concluded between countries that have already ratified and in most cases fully implemented those multilateral environmental agreements. So this mechanism probably do very little to explain increased environmental performance. And then we looked at the impact of environmental provision in domestic regulation. Are parties to a trade agreement with environmental provision more likely to adopt new environmental regulation? And the short answer is yes, but only for developing countries, not for high-income countries. And the effect is much stronger for regional issues, such as air pollution, not so much for global issues, such as climate change. And the effect is strong only between the conclusion of the trade agreement and its entry into force. And the effect is much reduced after the entry into force of the trade agreement. Still, this is promising because the effect of a trade agreement with environmental provision on domestic environmental regulation is even stronger than the effect of an environmental agreement, an environmental treaty on domestic environmental regulation of the same issue area. And the fact that the trade agreement with environmental provisions can have stronger effect on domestic law than an environmental agreement might have to do with the fact that a trade agreement typically have a stronger coercive power than most environmental agreements, right? So, and there is evidence, both qualitative and quantitative, that a trade agreement with a strong enforcement mechanism for its environmental provisions is more likely to increase environmental performance than a trade agreement without such strong enforcement mechanism applicable to the environmental provision. So it looks like the threat basically of sanctions incentivize countries to reform their domestic environmental laws, especially before trade agreements enter into force. Now, big stick is only one aspect of coercion, right? There's also the carrot of aid. And as you can see, environmental aid has increased in the last 2 decades, both in absolute and in relative numbers. This is still unpublished, but we have preliminary results suggesting that the number of environmental provision in a trade agreement is positively associated with environmental aid, especially during the negotiation phase of the trade agreement. So this suggests that in the context of the North-South negotiation, environmental aid can serve as a side payment basically for recipient to agree upon already formulated environmental chapters. But we do not find that the more a trade agreement include environmental provision, the more environmental aid we find that the more a trade agreement include environmental provision, the more environmental aid diminishes rather than increases after the trade agreement enters into force. So it seems that perhaps a green trade agreement decreases the necessity for donor countries to use the incentives of environmental aid to promote their objectives, because they already have an agreement, so they don't need to provide as much environmental aid as they used to. Then there's other form of cooperation, other design features that are expected to have an effect only after a trade agreement enters into force. This is the case of several types of environmental provision related to cooperation, could be exchange of information, scientific cooperation, stakeholder committees, for example. The US, the EU, Canada also typically include some of these cooperative mechanisms in their trade agreements. There is evidence suggesting that these mechanisms can increase environmental performance after the entry into force of the trade agreement. However, when we conducted interviews with officials responsible for the implementation of those mechanisms, we found that they are not as effective as they can be. In some cases, actors that are supposed to cooperate through these joint institutions, be they scientists, civil society actors, governmental officials, they're not sufficiently organized, they are not sufficiently supported to take full benefit, full advantage of these opportunities. And in other cases, the institutional design is not sufficiently focused on environmental matters, and more traditional trade issues will come to dominate the sustainable development agenda. So it's called sustainable development, but in the end, they mainly talk about trade, not so much about the environment. And lastly, trade flows. So a last causal pathway between trade agreements and environmental provision and increased environmental performance might have to do with change in trade composition. And so we did a study on this, focusing on exports from developing countries. And we have found that a trade agreement with environmental exceptions to trade commitment, so exceptions, reduce exports of dirty goods, such as steel or cement, for example. And in contrast, including environmental provision in your trade agreement, environmental provision that favor transparency on environmental regulation, international environmental standards, sustainable trade, those provisions tend to increase exports of green goods, like equipment for wind power, for example. So, in conclusion, how a trade agreement can be designed to increase environmental performance? Well, include very specific obligation with specific targets and clear time frame. Do not simply refer to a multilateral environmental agreement. Second, include a strong enforcement mechanism and make it well known before the entry into force of the trade agreement, because this is the time period that really matter. Third, make sure that that environmental aid increases after the entry into force rather than decrease by including very specific commitment on this matter. Fourth, support domestic actors participating in institutional mechanisms for cooperation. Fifth, have very broad environmental exceptions to trade commitments. And lastly, promote the diffusion of environmental technologies and trade in green environmental goods and services. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I think that was fascinating empirical data that you brought to bear, and also some of the practical implications for policy were very, very, very helpful, I think, to our discussion. We're now going to move on to our third presentation, which is by Susanne Dröge, who's a senior fellow in the Global Issues Division at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin, which I was mentioning to her earlier. I had the pleasure of visiting several times in my own research. She holds a PhD in economics with research focusing on EU, US, Chinese, as well as climate policy strategies of other countries, and the way that trade issues come along with ambitious climate targets and instruments in relation to international climate negotiations. Susanne sits on various advisory boards and advises the German parliament and government, international institutions, as well as civil society organizations on climate policy issues. And her talk is looking at the intersection between trade regime and policies on the one hand and climate action on the other.
Yes, well, I thought I'll give an overview that is more focused on the climate change agenda and the regimes, and this is food for thought and discussion, so let's see where we get with it. And within a project that we conducted straight after the Paris Agreement was signed, not ratified, but signed in 2015, we took some effort to bring together the elements of these two regimes, the trade regime in blue and the climate regime in green, and put in this box in the middle, the trends, the rules and norms and the institutional processes to look at. So what you can see here is clearly that there's some overlap, that the climate regime actually intersects with the trade regime in various ways. I don't want to go through all the details. While the trade regime has also some sphere where there is not yet climate agenda included, while probably an environmental agenda is, and that that the new kid in town here with the Paris Agreement are the so-called nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, which actually help countries or make countries to think of concrete policy proposals that they submit to the UNFCCC, and that could, of course, have a high relevance for trade relations as well. So then, of course, benefits have been mentioned and co-benefits have been mentioned, and actually I took these icons from WTO presentations, which is mostly the regime that we are talking about when we talk about the trade regime internationally. And so, of course, this institution that is in charge of making trade rules-based and multilateral knows and has been discussing for many years the benefits that come along with affordable protection that is enabled by trade, fast adoption of technologies, innovation investment in earth-friendly solutions or opportunities for workers and enterprises. Also, sustainable development and SDGs come into play here. But I would really like to go back to what we know about the Paris Agreement that could overlap with the trade regime. And that basically is, you need to know that the Paris Agreement as such is not referring to trade at all, while the Kyoto Protocol does, and also the Framework Convention does. But the elements that are touched upon in the agreement will definitely have an impact on trade relations and will increase the role of trade. First of all, it's the market mechanisms that are covered by the Article 6 in the Paris Agreement, not yet finished in the rulebook discussions. We will need the COP26 in November for that. And of course, that is basically about trading of emission rights, but the definition of services that relate, for instance, to investments that are climate friendly, touch upon the general agreement on trade and services. There is a potential for the allocation of mitigation efforts under domestic climate policies that will interfere with trade regime rules on subsidies and countervailing measures. Then we have transfer of technologies through trade. That means implementation of actual measures that are under a, well, for instance, in the forums that discuss means of implementation for poorer countries, and that is where intellectual property rights come in. So the TRIPS basically, and of course also the reconciliation of industrial countries' interests with developing countries' interests as WTO members. Then carbon pricing is the kid in town at the moment. We'll get to that in a minute, where of course the intersection between emissions trading and national carbon pricing is important. Many countries are increasingly interested in carbon pricing, but carbon leakage issues arise, so that it means a competitiveness effect that has been introduced by David very nicely with the Canadian example. And so the question is how to adjust for such a competitiveness effect if the cooperation level on carbon pricing is lacking or the level playing field is lacking. Then, of course, the energy sector is as the center of attention for all countries that are ambitious about climate protection. It is simply because it has at least 2/3, if not 3/4 of the emissions that we're talking about that are critical. And supporting renewable energy production, for instance, by rules of origin, by subsidization, is taking place in many countries, and that could be in conflict with anti-subsidization rules. And of course, local contact clauses are critical in the trade regime. And the removal of fossil fuel subsidies has been mentioned too. There is a long-standing debate in the international arena about fishery subsidies. There will be a ministerial conference soon by the WTO members, where again the hope is to bring that forward, and that would be a strong signal also into the direction of fossil fuel subsidy reductions that relate to climate protection, and obviously would generate high benefits for emission reductions. And of course, again here, as I said, I will focus on the WTO. This is a forum where these debates could take place. Of course, it is not the primary place to reduce fossil fuel subsidies probably, but energy has a special role to play in the international regime. It is not covered by the WTO rules as such, but of course, the rules for transparency and policy coordination matter also in this respect. Now, state of play in this arena is that the debates that we see now coming about with plans for border carbon adjustments and the proposal by the EU and its carbon border adjustment mechanism, we call it the CBAM, raise the tensions that relate to trade. Jean-Frédéric has shown the many interactions between trade, which is beneficial and sometimes detrimental to environmental protection. And in this respect, the attention is rising when it comes to carbon content of trade. So carbon that is flowing around the globe, embedded in goods. And of course, this relates to the way that goods are produced, which should not constitute a characteristic so far under WTO law, that is so-called products and production measures, and like product definitions are touched upon here. Then tariffs for renewables, as mentioned, and related technologies are higher than for fossil fuel ones. That is what the latest work by Shapiro showed for the US. That is, of course, I mean, it's not very surprising, but it needs, of course, it needs to be taken up by policymakers, and further research is obviously needed in order how to address this. And the contested subsidies for renewables and this situation with the fossil fuel tariff rates needs to be sorted out. So what are national climate ambitions? Do they inhibit, are they inhibited by trade practices and trade rules? As has been mentioned, it's obviously there as a chilling effect at least. And then last but not least, the national climate policy tools like the EU's border adjustment pronounce that there is a challenge definitely also for trade policy cooperation out there in a setting where multilateral attempts are really weak. Now, that means we'll have to talk and look into the plans for a reform of the WTO, new trade deals, as mentioned, how to design them with environmental provisions, what type of provisions and what bite they would have, and the problem or the issue of a rising number of non-tariff trade barriers. Yeah, the appellate body that could play a crucial role in deciding on such things is blocked at the moment by the United States. And so there are attempts taken after the change in government in the US to take care of that. Now, what are the benefits of the trade system that could use all for environmental and the climate regime? Is of course this list of principles of non-discrimination, avoidance of unnecessary barriers, harmonization, transparency. You will find nearly all of this also in the climate regime. But I took this picture from a presentation of a WTO person. And of course, it is about a balance between the rights to adopt measures to achieve legitimate goals. And it's clear the signals are that climate protection is legitimate, also in the multilateral setting, while rights of others under the basic trade rules should not be reduced. We did some work and output on the options to align the WTO regime with climate policy challenges. I don't want to go through all this. It's just basically 3 areas: the legal changes that are needed, hard to establish; procedural changes in institutional practices, this is emerging, and actions under the non-WTO or regional agreements, and probably WTO plurilateral agreements are needed. For the transatlantic cooperation, I see a number of challenges and probably research needs. How to approach the WTO situation, what is needed in order to get to terms with the problem with China not being acknowledged as a market economy yet. The situation between the US and China, we just had a speech by Catherine Tai yesterday, and how to get back to a more multilateral atmosphere and cooperation. Here, there are other countries blocking the talk. It's not only about the US or China or others that are identified as villains. It's rather complex, and Geneva has its own rules in how cooperation could function. The climate ambition and the differing national approaches to implementation will keep us very busy. They will increase. There is, at least this year for the COP26, some more ambition in the air, basically because the US are back to the table. But how can all this be aligned? How could coordination function, especially if, for instance, the EU CBAM should be recognized by the US as something that is in their own interest? Probably the US will introduce some border adjustments themselves without a carbon price. So how could that all be aligned and coordinated? And the regulations that are up in the air and probably will materialize, how could they be coordinated also when it comes to trade barriers and non-tariff areas? It's about sectors that are specifically climate intensive and technologies that are low carbon. New bilateral trade agendas are also important to be set up. Jean-Frédéric has mentioned a number of design elements that are needed and that there needs to be some bite for these provisions. Geopolitically, it's all about the Chinese situation or the US-China situation. At least from the European point of view, we are pretty much on the sideline. We try to sort this out for ourselves. And this is where the CBAM has really geopolitical impact and role to play. And last but not least, which forums and institutions will matter in the near future for sorting out this kind of coordination needs when it comes to impacts from climate policy making on trade. So far, so good. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I'm happy to elaborate on other points you may want to ask me.
Thank you very much for that presentation. So I'm now going to turn the floor over to my colleague, Gabriele Spilker, who, as I mentioned, is the co-organizer of this series of panels in this workshop. She's a professor for international politics and global inequality at the University of Konstanz in Germany. Her main research interests relate to international political economy and international cooperation, but with a special focus on precisely this intersection between trade and environmental politics. She's published widely in esteemed journals like the British Journal of Political Science, International Organization, the Journal of Politics, and Nature Climate Change. So Gabi, you can give us your comments, and then we'll thrust ourselves into a discussion. So if you're thinking of asking a question and you're in the audience, you can start framing that now and either put it into the chat or put it into the raise your little electronic hand in the reactions menu item there. And after Gabriele is finished with her comments, we'll take a couple of questions from the floor and then go back to our panelists.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Joanne, for the introduction. And more importantly, thanks to Susanne, Jean-Frédéric, and David for these very interesting and great presentations. When we prepared for the event today, we really had thought like, oh, how can we make this fit together and the like? And you always are a bit like afraid that it doesn't work out so well. And I'm just so happy that today it just worked out super well in that you really had these presentations that for me totally build on each other and made a really interesting story. And my role now is easy. I just want to kind of repeat a bit what I think are the main points to take away from your presentations. And then I have probably a trillion of questions. And this is one thing that I do not want to take away too many questions from the audience. So if you happen to have then questions, please jump in before, otherwise I just fill it all up with all my trillions of questions. So what I really liked about the presentations, or how I think they fit together, is that David started to talk about how the domestic audience really influences what happens on the international side, on the preferential trade agreement side, but also how these preferential trade agreements are perceived by domestic audiences, and how this perception really matters then again in the domestic rearmament politics and kind of influences again the next generation of preferential trade agreements. And here's something very interesting happens, I think, as I also see it in my research, namely that, and this is something that Jean-Frédéric really nicely introduced, that in everyone who studies trade or the intersection between trade and in the environment really sees that there are, of course, detrimental effects of trade on the environment, but also positive effects on trade on the environment. So a priori, it's not clear whether trade has a positive or negative effect on the environment. It just has both. It has different mechanisms, how it influences the environment. And depending on which is stronger or not, we have on average positive or negative sides, but it has this very complex, or it's a very complex relationship with both positive and negative issues. And something that happens then on the domestic side of the story is often that this positive aspects are absolutely not talked about either at all or are really pushed aside, but rather these potential negative consequences of trade are often rightly so taken up by NGOs and other civic organizations who try to make these agreements better and stronger in the way that Jean-Frédéric told us how to do so. But also, and this is a very interesting point, a very important point that David mentioned, often they are used by other interest groups that are not so much interested in the environment, I would argue, but rather taken up just to get more protection or to be shielded from international competition, and in so far do not help the environment either, so to say. And this is really one point that I want to raise and want to ask both David and Jean-Frédéric, and this is something I found really tough in my research, to pinpoint how to communicate for one better to domestic audiences, especially so the general public, that trade has these more complex kind of consequences, and that indeed preferential trade agreements can be used to foster, so to say, environmental protection if, as Jean-Frédéric nicely pointed out, they are rightly designed. And this brings me then to the next question I have, especially for Jean-Frédéric, namely how he was a bit silent on how these preferential trade agreements are negotiated and how they are designed. And this is really the difficult point that we often see, especially in the European Union side. How do we reconcile it, and how do we get these really strict environmental conditions that we need for these preferential trade agreements to really make environmental protection most likely? And here, a question that I have that then brings me over to Susanne's talk is really, from following both the discourse, especially so in the European Union, but also from doing my research, I often am not sure how much it's really the design of preferential trade agreements that influences both public opinion, but also how interest group and NGOs react. But isn't it often more the partner country? So often these preferential trade agreements are completely under the radar if other not so powerful partner countries are in play. But on the European side, these preferential trade agreements, and especially the clauses that David mentioned, ISDS, became super important once the other side was suddenly Canada or the US even, because suddenly then this was a probably more powerful country, and probably these things could do something to the European side too. So one further question I would like to ask is really, how much is it the content of the trade agreement, and how much is it really the partner country and who the partner country is, what the domestic environmental kind of policies of the other country are? And in this context, I have another question for Jean-Frédéric, namely he told us that it's often that it's despite the preferential trade agreements mentioning multilateral environmental agreements, so the MEAs, it's often the MEAs that precede the PTAs. But from your research, what I would like to know is, can it not also be that the PTAs might be used to then put more importance, more leverage to the MEAs in that they make them more prominent, that they really are put to the forefront, that maybe, in so to say, they're enforced through the back door. And this enforcement issue then brings me to Susanne's presentation, which I found really, really interesting. And here I have a few questions that really, I mean, one is more on speculation, or Susanne, I would love to hear Susanne's speculation on this. And this is really how much you think the WTO will be back in town, in the sense of how much will it all depend on the US changing its position towards the WTO? And might it not be that, especially from a European context, climate change, or the issue of climate change now is so important, really, that whether as specific rules, especially the CBAM, is completely WTO conform, in line with WTO rules, is this the most important issue, or isn't it rather that they all think like, oh, let's see how the US reacts, and if the US keeps on blocking kind of the WTO system, so we just go the way we want to go. On the CBAM, what I would like, and this brings me back to David's issue at the beginning, like the ISDS and the question of really democratic legitimacy. So I read one of your newest policy brief for the SVP today and found it so interesting on the issues with the CBAM really is how to design it and which sectors to include, and then what to do with the money you raise with the CBAM. And here I have two questions. So there is one trade-off between the bureaucracy in the CBAM. So if you wanted to design a perfect CBAM, it's so complicated in some sense, bureaucracy-wise, that it's kind of not efficient to kind of do so. And here I see a tendency to what David said at the beginning, that it might be that or whether you might perceive it that way, that's my question really. Might there be a legitimacy problem for the CBAM if not all sectors are included? While on the other side, they can't be included because it won't make it efficient. I'm not sure whether I make myself completely clear, but whether there might be like a tendency that these two things run against each other, that we have less legitimacy on the domestic or back on the democratic domestic front, but which would on the other side, this more efficient way to deal with this, make it easier to implement. And then one final question that brings me back to both David and Jean-Frédéric's points is the question you didn't talk in the presentation, but you talk in your work, Susanne, is what to do with the money you raise with the CBAM. And here my question is, do you think there's a way to use this money to make domestic audiences, like kind of compensate them from potential losses they occur from trade liberalization, but also to raise them or to use it in a way how Jean-Frédéric mentioned it, like fostering environmental policy as potentially using it as environmental aid in other places. And I think here I might just stop because I don't want to monopolize too much, but as you see with all my questions, these are, I think, so fascinating presentations and topics.